Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 2, page 1151. Aleph Kuf Nun Aleph. So yes, we've returned to the actual Ayin Beis after learning the explanations of the Frierdiker Rebbe in Sadik Daled. So we're at page 1151, and what we began learning is that we established the two levels of Ayin. I should say the one level of Ayin, that channel of Ayin of Oir, in between Yesh Amiti and Yesh Anivra, the absolute true reality of the Creator, and the Yesh Anivra, the created reality. There's Ayin. That Ayin divides into two, with all the different interpretations. He's now going and saying that even though it's called Ayin in general, that's its name, it's not its interpretation, its meaning is different, is not the same when you're talking from the perspective of the mashpia, or you're talking from the perspective of the recipient. In the parentheses, he qualified that mashpia means everything comes from him, but he's not in the category where you can identify him as a relationship or in any way commensurate, being a mocker to what comes from him, because it's completely removed. So you can use the word nimtze mimenu, amitisi motzi nimtze kontzai. And what he begins saying, so what does the ayin mean from the perspective of the mashpia? He says, L'gabi yesh amiti, the meaning of ayin is that ein a tefes mokim klal. So ayin means it's nothing. I don't like to use the word worthless or valueless, because that also signifies a type of negative. What here is that it doesn't have any significance. Not because it has no self-esteem, it's because compared to Atzmus, nothing else is real. Everything is just a reflection. So the most it is, even Etzema Eiri says, is not Tefes Mokim Klal or Klal, comparing from the context of Atzmus. Because Atzmus is a reality that, as we learned earlier, is the only absolute must and total true reality, due to the fact that it's Mitzusim Atzmusei, built in Mitzias Nimtze, Mechuyev HaMitzias, the Frierdiker Rebbe added in Sadik Daled, meaning it's an existence that's not unlike any other existence, because it's the only thing that must be. Everything else has a source. Even Oyer, even Etzem Oyer doesn't must be. It doesn't have to be. God could not be. He has the capacity not to give off light. There's no must. The only thing that must be is an absolute reality, and by definition, that makes it a reality, existence, unlike anything we know. Anything we'll ever experience, because everything we experience is a defined reality, is a manifest reality. Now, you could say you want more information on that. We learned that for hours and hours. So I would refer you back to the sections in Ayin Beis and Sadik Daled, where we went over this at length, what it means to be a Yesh Amiti. When you learn that, you understand what it means here, Ayin of Ha'ara Ba'alma. If you don't learn that, it's going to be hard to understand this. So I would definitely refer you back to where he begins talking about the Yesh Amiti in Ayin Beis. I'll tell you what page it is. It's the beginning of the Rosh Hashanah Maimer of Ayin Vav, Ayin Vav, which is essentially starting from the bottom of page 1141. The next few pages after that talks a lot about what is a true reality. When you finish that, and then you go back here, you realize what he means, that only the Yesh Amiti is a true reality. Therefore, everything else is in a Tefes Mokim Klal o Klal. Literally, Tefes Mokim means it doesn't carry any weight, doesn't carry any space. Tefes means to contain space, or Tefes, it has any Tefes Mokim. You say something is Tefes Mokim means you consider it. It has some force or power, some space, not physical space, some value that you consider. When you say something is not Tefes Mokim, means it's completely irrelevant and completely insignificant from the level of Yesh Amiti. So that's page 1141 in Sadik Daled, if you want to look into it. And remember, everything has been recorded to classes. So there, look at pages, let's see where. Well, starting page 6 and 7, but really gets deeper into it a little later. Where does he get into it? Just giving you for the information purposes. After 25, page 25, and then again, after page 30, you have to look around there because there's a lot about it. Okay. So any tefes malkum klal klal, fine. Then he went to say, that's why Ani Hashem leishanisi. And as I explained yesterday, this is what's he coming to add here. Now, this is not a sugi of discussing shinui in Atzmus, in Hashem. He's coming to demonstrate how removed he is. Completely, the concept of there's no shinui there. Why? Because everything is only a reflection. And a reflection does not affect its source. Light does not impact the source of light. And for that matter, even objects that light shines on doesn't affect the light. But that's not what he's addressing here. He's not talking about the light. He's talking about the source of light. So he says, because everything is only a reflection. Since God did not have to give off light, and he did, and the whole light is only a reflection, has nothing to do with the atzmi. So therefore he said that it's leishanisi. And he said, l'cheira yifla hadavar, how could it be? Everything that was emanated, all the Natzalim and all the Nivraim and all the creations come from him. How do you explain it in a logical way? Everything comes from a source. So you would think once it comes from the source, there was some impact, some shinri. So he says no, because everything that came from the reflection, not from Atzmus. Now, does not mean that the root, of course, is from us, because if there's no oir, if there's no etzem, there's no oir. There would be no oir. But so-called activity, what we call the activity of creation, meaning something happening and something before and something after, stages, and therefore impact and shinui is all happening in the level of ha'ara. And I explained it at length yesterday. I'm not going to go over it again. We discussed it at length that it's not just that God is not affected. It's because the whole concept of effect and impact is all happening, and that's the way God made it, that we should have some understanding in the oir, not in the etzem. And thus, he says, since ha'ara completely has no significance in the source, that's why there's no shinui. So I went deeper. It's not just there's no shinui because light doesn't affect the source. The source is beyond the word of change, the word of impact, stages. All this is not applicable to a state of atzmus. Now, so we have to be very careful not to try to apply any of our logical structures and ideas to atzmus. It's just not applicable. So really, atzmus really remains a mystery. Yet we still talk about it because atzmus allowed us some sense, some understanding, some sense. If you follow the right rules and the right tools, especially with bittul, you can get some sense. But it's mostly through extrapolations, mostly through yediyas hashlila. You say Mitzvah is built to Mitzvah nimtza. That alone is shlila. He exists, but not in any existential way. It's a not. By saying it's not like our existence, we're saying we're getting some sense of what he's not, so therefore something you begin to relate to at least. So I've given many examples of how we can relate. Mitzvah Matzmusi, for example, the fact that we feel that we are self-made entities and we don't identify and relate to any source, the Alter Rebbe says, is a taste of Atzmus Mitzvah Matzmusi. A taste, he says, it originates from there. Okay. So this is where we stop. Be'emes ein shinui, ein shum shinui klal. So to wrap your head around it is almost impossible, if not impossible, because what does that mean? So did God create or did he not create? Is there before creation or not before creation? So then you have to say the whole creation is not even happening within Atzmus. It's happening in a field of energy that God extended. Now obviously Atzmus is everywhere. But it's not, but he's removed from everything. So you have to say it's all happening there. And that's where you have the concept of time, space, before space, levels, and so on. Atahu actually nivra elam, va'atahu lachish nivra elam. You are atahu. You are the one before creation, and you're the same one after. And Chassidus teaches bli shum shinei klal, that remains intact without any change. Bli shum shinei, atahu before, after. So what we call before and after has no effect in atzmus. V'im came pirish ayin. So based on this, what is the meaning of ayin? When you say the ayin amiti, the ayin from the yesh amiti, in other words, that level that God extended, which is light. What does it mean, ayin? Hu sha'ir v'agili min ha'atzmus u'b'chinas ayin mamish l'gaba atzmus. So the meaning of ayin in this context, from the perspective of the source, is that the oir and the light and revelation from atzmus is ayin mamish l'gaba atzmus she'ein tefes mokum klal. So ayin means here completely nullified, completely insignificant compared to atzmus, l'gaba atzmus, that it has no tefes, not tefes mokum, doesn't have any value at all. So to give an example, if you say, for example, the infinite set of numbers in mathematics, and then there's the finite set of numbers. So we know the finite will never touch infinite because finite numbers can never reach infinity. That's the rule. So the finite can go on and on and on to trillions and zillions and beyond, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's the infinite set of numbers. So you would say, what is the finite compared to infinite? Is it tefes mokum? The answer it is. It's not as large as infinite, and it's completely of a different quality, but you cannot say that infinity negates the very being of number one. You could say number one is lacking infinity, but you can't say that infinity looks at number one as if it doesn't exist. Even though 1 and a trillion are equal in the eyes of infinity, literally equal, you don't get closer to it, but to say, because they're both the set of numbers. Infinity is a set of numbers, and so is the finite. So you could say what it's lacking is what it doesn't have. But what it has, you can't say it's not tefes mokum. It's equal. It equalizes everything. Let's talk about now an entity that doesn't even recognize numbers altogether. For that point entity, even the infinite and the finite are equal, because if infinite and finite are insignificant to it. So in other words, insignificance can be that is beyond, but at least it has something in common. Or it's something so beyond that there's nothing, not only nothing in common, that everything is completely meaningless. Infinite, finite. Infinite is not more impressive than the finite when you're talking about this.
There's no such thing beside atzmus, because really infinite and finite, they are also completely you could say it's not tefes mokum, but the way that you describe that both are equal, this is only atzmus. There's no other thing like that.
Correct. Yeah. It's so deep that atzmus can even go ahead and manifest himself in finite and infinite. So it's not just that he's beyond, he can go there and still not be nitfis in it. That's how deep it is. It's not just he prides himself of being beyond it all. He can be there and not be there. The whole thing is completely not in the realm of what we have any understanding of. Okay. So bottom line is, so therefore the meaning of ayin here, let's just read it again. Pirush ayin, from this perspective, that the oyer v'agil min atzmus ub'chinas ayin mamish. Ayin from the meaning, nothing. Mamish nothing. She'ein tefes mokum klal. Klal don't tefes mokum. Okay. In other words, not only its weakness is not tefes mokum, its strength also is not tefes mokum. It's an important point, because sometimes you could say, you know what, a chacham gadol, like I said with infinity, chacham gadol, fine. What a chacham katan, someone in smaller stature, a lower stature intelligence, he's much beyond it, and he doesn't consider him. because it's a different league. Great Talmid Chacham, Tanoim, great Talmid Chacham. But what's lacking by the Chacham cotton? Not the Chachma that he has, the Chachma he doesn't have. But the Chachma that he has, even if it's Ayin Beis, the Chacham Gadol can't say it's not Teifus Malkim. He could just say we're beyond it. Same idea as I said with the numbers. When you're talking about Atzmus, even the Chacham itself that he has no meaning or significance. So it's not like, it's not what you're lacking, even what you have has no value. Because who gives it value? Okay. So it's truly an entity, if I can call it that, Atzmus, that's beyond, like we said, Shlila Sachiyuv and Shlila Sashlila, and Shlila Sachiyuv, it's just not anything that you could define in any given way. Therefore, all definitions are ayin compared to it. Now he's going to talk.
I'm sorry. Does the or have to reflect the Atzmus?
It's not the discussion of this piece here.
We have talked about it, though. Yeah.
We have. When we talked about it, we talked about it at length. That's why I refer you to there. But if you're going to go here now, it's exactly the opposite point he wants to make here. Does the have to? The doesn't have to do anything. The does only what God wants it to do.
Right.
So the the is generally a reflection, but the is never Atzmus. The never has to be. Even if the reflects this about Atzmus that we're talking about, it's still ayin compared to Atzmus. Atzmus is able to convey this to us. Look, we're talking about it right now to some extent. It's just not it. We can talk about it. So can so-called carry this message. Ultimately carries the power of Bria. If you go to Ageres HaKedesh, Simachov, where he talks about Mitzvah Matzmus, he says that's carried through to create. Now, doesn't have the power to create. Itself is a creation. But it carries God's power to create because of its bittul. So yes, it carries it. But it doesn't negate what it says here, because the fact it carries it doesn't mean that it's closer to Atzmus. It just means it has the ability, because of its bittul, complete selflessness, to carry part of Atzmus's power. But it never becomes Atzmus and never defines itself as Atzmus.
Because of its bittul, it manifests.
It's not because of its bittul, it's whole mitzias is bittul. There's no such thing as without bittul. Take away bittul, you have no
Right, of course.
So start the other way around. It's God created bittul, if you want, put it that way. And that bittul is called
Okay, thank you.
Now he's going to talk about ayin, a second interpretation from the perspective of the makabel, recipient. Here ayin has a different meaning. Ach b'chinas ayin hamoked ala makablim, ala makablim. Interesting is to say hamoked el with an aleph or with an ayin. Okay, he says with an ayin, which means on. Yeah, you can interpret it both ways.
You are in Kuf Nun, Aleph Kuf Nun, 1150.
1151, Aleph Kuf Nun Aleph, the middle of the page. Okay, so he says now, the ayin, however, the level of ayin, as it is a mocker, a source of or upon the recipients, hainu b'chinas hayesh hanivra, which means it's the ayin of the yesh hanivra, the yesh, the created yesh. So we're now talking
Should be
from the bottom up. How the ayin, how the yesh, what?
Should be a Aleph, not Al, L, I think.
I know, that's what I just suggested, but you could, bedechik, you could do an ayin. You could say a mokavus is hecher fadim makam. Yeah, I'd have to look it up, but right now it's an ayin. They didn't correct it. Fine, it's possible it's an aleph. So this is now the ayin of the yesh hanivra, the created yesh. Mashanikra ayin. Here is I'm going to say like this. Why is it called ayin? Legabe hayesh. You can't say the same thing legabe the yesh that we say that the ayin of the yesh hanivra, meaning the energy, the divine energy that applies itself and relates and shapes existence in whatever interpretation, whether it's pnimi or it's whether it's the lower level of pnimi, the chitzenius or spashtus or it's pnimi compared to seviv, or it's the spashtus before the tzimtzum. He says you can't call that ayin not teifus makim. It's not teifus makim by us. As a matter of fact, it's superior to us. So what you said ayin by yesh miti, you said it's not teifus makim because ayin yesh miti is completely beyond. So what's the meaning of ayin from the yesh nivris? He says it's not the meaning. He says like this again. One second, I skipped the line. I'm sorry. This is not due because it doesn't carry any significance and value. That statement is exclusive. He doesn't say exclusive, but that shaykh, that relates only to atzmus, like we said earlier. And compared to atzmus, the yesh hanesava, even the oir doesn't have any significance. For sure, the yesh hanesava doesn't have significance. Why is he adding that? Not sure why, but he does say it. But when you're talking from the perspective of the created yesh, from the perspective of atzmus, oir and yesh, ayin means it's not teifus makim. But from the perspective of the created yesh, it's not possible. It's not. You're not able to say shubchin is head that tfisas makim, that the ayin that creates the yesh and esava doesn't have any significance. Shari memenu hu esava sayesh. From that ayin came the creation. So then, why do we call it ayin? Well, let's continue reading before he explains why we call ayin. So, bottom line is established that the interpretation of ayin as a state of insignificance does not apply from the bottom up, from the perspective of the created yesh, because the created yesh came from the ayin. From atzmus, the ayin is a yerida. I don't want to call the word yerida. It means it's completely insignificant because atzmus is beyond it all. But from the point of view of the created yesh, the yesh can't say ayin is beyond, I'm beyond it all. You're lower than it. You're actually a creation of it. Let's continue reading. And this is what is called the ayin of the yesh. It's the mokir. It's the source that creates the yesh. So then why do we call it ayin? We can't say it means insignificance. So what does it mean? She says, he says like this, Mashanikra ayin, what is called ayin, because it doesn't have any substance. It doesn't have anything that we can hold on to, so to speak. It's not a kamay hayesh b'chinas mitzias yesh. The yesh, this table, this chair, this person, the sky, is a definable, tangible existence. The ayin that creates it is not. Not just that it's invisible. It's not defined by the parameters that we define existence. It's the source of existence. So the reason it's called ayin is not because it's not insignificant, it's because it is beyond us. It's beyond our form of existence. Essentially, it's actually the opposite. Not insignificant, it's even more significant, but it's sublime in its nature. And the source that creates is in a state of loy davar. What he means, not that it doesn't exist, that it doesn't exist on our terms. So that's why we call it ayin. It's like almost like saying the mysterious ayin, the unknown ayin. He doesn't use those words here. Here he means ayin as being not yesh. It's not yesh. It's not a defined yesh. It's the opposite of yesh in the fact that it's lacking the parameters and the substance of what we call an existing entity. So you have now two interpretations in the word ayin. Insignificance is the way it's understood from the Yesh HaMiti's perspective, and beyond our definition and parameters, or an entity that does not have substance as we know it, and that's why it's called ayin. That's the best way I can interpret it. Maybe they'll find more words, but right now we'll stick to that. Okay. So that's what we established now. So these two levels of the ayin, though in general we call it ayin, we now know that the ayin of the yesh nivra and the ayin of the yesh amiti have different meanings, and therefore different, in a sense, different function almost. Omnom, however, is a qualification. Gam bezeh, also now we're talking about the ayin of the yesh hanivra. The fact that we say loy davar, it's not substance, it doesn't have matter, so to speak. He says, Gam bezeh einay shahu b'bchinas loy davar klal. We don't say it's no substance at all. We say compared to the yesh, it's an ayin. A yesh is defined by I'm here, I'm present. And an ayin, if you remember, we learned about ruchnius. Ruchnius does not have to make a statement, I'm here. It's not defined by presence. So it's not defined by any parameters, physical parameters. But he's saying now, qualifying, he's saying, but that doesn't mean it's not a davar at all. Remember, this level of oir is be'erech hayesh. Like when the Eibusha said, Yehi oir. So yes, it's a ruchni's dike power, or Yehi oir, or Yehi rakia. So it's true. The words of Hashem, or the koyach ruchni, you can say it. The oir eliki, the divine oir, that is going to create a physical entity is not physical, but to say that it's completely beyond, that has no relationship, of course it does. It's actually mitzumtzum and defined and relates to the thing it's going to create. It's be'erech hayesh li'ez b'chinas moker elav. You can't say it's not a moker, it's a moker, it's an absolute moker. If Hashem didn't say Yehi oyer, Yehi rakia, or like he says in Shayach Damuna, Basarim Amoris Nivre'elam, everything was created with different utterances. If God did not channel his energy in specific words and letters and words that are machayim, ahavim, mekayim, that sustain, that create, sustain, and energize everything. So you could say, fine, it's coming from a higher level that doesn't relate to existence. But the whole point of the ayin of the yesh hanivra we learned is an ayin that relates to existence to some extent. So on one hand, it's an ayin compared to us. But to say that it's completely non-existent entity, no. As a matter of fact, the ayin, I don't know if he's going to say this, but probably, the ayin of the yesh hanivra compared to the higher levels of ayin is absolutely substance. If you were to ask ayin of the yesh amiti, tell me, what do you think about oir hachachim and atzilus? It would say oir hachachim is a defined entity. It has shape and form. If you asked Elam Hazeh Gashmi, what do you think about chachma atzilus? It would say, it's ayin. I don't know what it is. It's a sublime entity. So you see here that this ayin of the yesh hanivra, compared to the yesh, it's ayin. But to say that it completely doesn't have any shape and form and doesn't have any substance, you can't. That's what he's saying now, because it's a mukkar. It's been established to be a source and therefore relates to the created yesh. However, it's a ruchnis dika ayin. Let's see how he's going to word it. So he says like this. Being that this ayin of the yesh hanivra relates to and is the source of the created yesh, so you have to say that it's a davar ma, that is some form of something. Something is there because it relates to the creation. To the point that we're able to say about it, we can call it and we can identify it as a source. So for example, just using an example, we know that mayim, physical water, is rooted in chesed. Chesed of asiyah, which comes from chesed of yitzira, chesed of abriya, chesed of atzilus. Now chesed and mayim have nothing in common if you think about it. Chesed is a divine attribute of giving, of love, of flowing. Mayim is a physical entity. You touch water, you get wet. You can measure it. It has properties. You open up Mayim, you dissect Mayim, you're not going to find chesed in it. And yet we're told that the Ruchni is the chesed as it evolves. And when you put a physical so-called shell around it, that's Mayim. Now, the relationship between chesed and Mayim, therefore, is that chesed is like an ayin. If you talk about from the perspective of yesh, meaning things that we can sense with our five senses, chesed is invisible and not tangible. So it's the ayin of the yesh hanivra called mayim. Just as fire is the yesh that, or gvura is the ayin of the yesh hagvur of the yesh that's called fire. But now, if you talk about compared to higher levels, where you don't yet have chesed and gvura, levels where the spheres did not yet evolve, they did not yet emerge. So there, that ayin is completely removed. The Bechal doesn't even have let's call it a archetypal relationship. Chesed and mayim, you could say, just like chesed flows from the top down, like the Gemara says, ma mayim yerdim o mayla lamata. Why? Because chesed flows. Gvura is the opposite. Gvura crushes things. Gvura contracts things. Like Eish, what Eish does. Mayim is expansive, Eish is, so there are properties that have similarities. The difference is spiritual properties, and these are physical properties. But compared to higher levels, even the Gvura, and definitely the fire, even the Chesed, definitely the water, are completely not in the same realm. So that's what he's saying here, that it's not a dover ma, like fire or water, like the yesh, but to say that it's bichlal, not something, you can't. It has identity, it has a definition. The definition is to the point that you can call this is the source for this. If you try to go higher levels, someone say, where did Chesed Atzilis come from? And therefore, where did water come from? You go all the way up to the levels of Ayin Amiti. And Yesh Amiti, you can't identify it as a source. You can't say the Yesh Amiti has a certain property that will evolve to become water, or Chesed for that matter. It's become beyond any properties and any structure altogether. So there you can talk about it as he's a creator, like we said on the top of the page. He's not the gedder of a mokir. A gedder of a mokir means, yes, it's higher than the level that it's a source for, but it still has some relationship with it. So the ayin of the Yesha Nivra, or Yesha Misava, is, yes, it's loy dover. That's why it's called ayin from our perspective, but you can't call it loy dover completely, that it's as if it doesn't exist altogether. In our eyes, we don't relate to it, or we can't define it because it's so sublime. Okay. So now he's going to qualify this and say and ask, but one second, isn't creation shalei be'erech? When you create something, it's shalei be'erech. He's going to explain what I just said in more detail. He's going to distinguish between the creation of the water and its relationship with chesed. But he's going to qualify. He says, Ve'ima yes. And though the actual process of creation is a quantum leap beyond the quantum, it's be'ein arech. There's no erech between creator and creation. They're not like have a relationship with each other. Ukidua, as it's known, the isavas hayesh, ef shaliyas b'bchinas kiruv. The creation of a yesh, of a substantial entity, an entity of substance, I should say, cannot happen in close proximity. Kiruv erech. In other words, there's a close proximity. For example, if I want to take get a cup of water, and I take a pitcher, I fill it up with water, and I pour myself water. That's a kiruv be'erech. So the water in my cup is coming from the water in the pitcher. The pitcher is coming from, let's say, the sink. They're coming from the pipes, coming from the reservoirs, coming from the rainfall, or whatever, wherever water comes from, or for a body of a river or a well. There you identify, it's called kiruv erech. All those steps I just mentioned all have commensurate levels. One is a source for the next. Sometimes we describe it as yesh meyesh, sometimes ilav olo. But point being, it's very identifiable. Yes, it's a source, and that source produced something. But creation is not that way. Creation doesn't happen in incremental steps where the creator one step gets closer and closer. It's not kiruv erech like he's going to say now. The creator or the creative energy and the creation are distant from one another because it's not yesh miyesh. You're creating something from a completely different reality. You're creating something that didn't exist. So what is he implying here? So how could you tell me that the ayin of the yesh ha-mesaveh is be'erech in some way to the creation? We know the creation process is shalei be'erech. It's a leap. And now he's going to explain that even more. He didn't answer the question yet. He's just making the case. He says, "V'zehu shenevroim atzmon machlichim she'amoker b'chinas ayin." And this exactly is the reason that the creation or the creatures themselves compel us to say that the mocker is a level of ayin. Why tak is it ayin? Because creation doesn't happen in a logical progression. It's not like I take a torch of fire and I light a bunch of little fires. That's not how creation works. Creation there's one state that is completely spiritual. It doesn't have even one particle in it. It's not like you could say, let's say, just thinking of an example, take an element like water. We all know water has sediment in it. If you separate it, you'll ultimately be able to find particles in the water. But in Ruchnius, it's not like Ruchnius has somewhere hidden a little Gashmis and just get rid of the Ruchnius and it'll turn it to Gashmis. No, somewhere there's going to have to be a radical leap. A leap from a Ruach to Geshem. That's Ein Arech. That's exactly why we say that the creation could not have been by another Yesh. To say, for example, the sun created earth is absurd. Because the sun is a Yesh and the earth is a Yesh. To say one Yesh created another. You could say one Yesh goes Yesh mi-Yesh. Like I said, from water, you can produce more water. From a piece of gold, you can produce an ornament. Parents can produce children. Even though that's not a perfect example, because there is an element of yesh mayin. But my point is, it's not completely, there's the seed, the egg, the seed of a tree produces the next tree. That's yesh mi-yesh. When we say creation, what created the first yesh? You can't say another yesh created. That's why we call it ayin. That's what he's saying now. So the very creation is telling us that the creative force is unlike us. That's why he can create us. Because if it was like us, we can't create anything. You and I can't create because we are creations. We don't have the power to do something that we ourselves are. We are creation. Creation does not create other creation. We can only reshape. We can't create in the real sense of yesh ma'ayin. No, the joke, the scientist who tells God, we don't need you anymore. We can do whatever you can do. God says, show me. So he takes a clump of earth, puts it on his laboratory table, and he's going to show God how he can create, from the earth, he's going to make something grow. So God says to him, one second here, use your own earth. Yes, he's taking earth and he's going to replicate the growth process. Use your own earth. Try doing it without earth. Just as an example. So yes, we've developed great technologies and breakthroughs and so on. End of the day, we didn't create electricity. We didn't create subatomic particles. They were there in existence. We learned that they are there. We learned how to manipulate them. We learned how to access them. We know how to tap them for energy. And we have a beautiful world, a much better, more comfortable world than ever before. But it's all yesh mi-yesh. It's not yesh ma'ay. Someone says, go create a completely new entity without anything from before. Yesh ma'ayin says, b'chek ha-broyre, not b'chek ha-nivroim. If you took, it says in Chazal, the Medrash, that all the Chachamim be'elam, Wisconsin would come together. They couldn't even create the wing of a fly. Now, I know today we create synthetic materials and we replicate, but first of all, it's all coming from materials that exist already. Even synthetic materials is what? It's manipulating different items that turn it into some type of Teflon or plastic or whatever it may be. But the point is, yesh, so therefore the yesh compels us to say that its creative force that created it is of a different type of reality. It's an ayin, meaning it's shalei be'erech to it. That's what he's building towards. So where's their erech? That's what he's coming to explain. Okay, so what does he say? So the yesh itself, the nivroim atzma machlichim shamokra b'chinasayin. U'kamoisha emir, or kamoisha emrim, we say in davening and Shabbos, ein arech lecha be'elam hazeh. So the whole Lashen is there. Ein arech lecha, efes biltecha, etc. So what does it say? Ein arech dafke be'elam hazeh. Ein arech lecha. That in elam hazeh we see the ein arech of godliness. As he explains, this is something that we learned all the way in the beginning of Ayin Beis. I don't know if you remember it. Like maybe page 8 or something, or 9. So he talks about Ein Arech Lecha Dafken Elam Hazeh. So he explains the Be'elam Hazeh Nira V'Nigla. It's Dafke in this world, this material world, that it becomes Nira, obvious, and Nigla and revealed. Eich She'ein Arech. How the Eibishter is Ein Arech, beyond us completely. The Kasher Anuroyim Mitzias Yesh. Because when we see a physical entity, yesh, muchrach sheishavusei hu mebchinas ayin. It compels us. It compels us to say that its creation came from something that is ayin and not a yesh. You'll say, what's the proof? What's the proof of that? So let me just first explain what it means. We're going to learn this later in Ayin Beis and Tzadik Daled. For example, when you look at Atzilus, Atzilus doesn't tell you about the Ein Arech. Atzilus tells you that God has the capacity of attributes. Chochmah, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. Atzilus doesn't indicate an Ein Arech. If you only knew about Atzilus, you'd say that Elikus manifests in spheres, in some form of spiritual structure. It's only a world like ours where there's something that's a yesh, that does not reveal anything that's godly. And you say to yourself, where did this yesh come from? Ein dover eser satzme. Atzilus can trace its roots to Akudim, to Ak, even to Eir Lifnei Atzimtzum, Eser Spheres Hagnuzis, because it's manifests divine attributes. Obviously, we know that God is beyond attributes, but Atzilus is not teaching us that. It's not teaching us how Atzmus is beyond attributes. Atzilus teaches us how Atzmus relates to attributes. Elam Hazeh, suddenly you have a yesh that doesn't indicate on any godliness source. A yesh that is self-contained, and we know nothing can create itself. It's a finite, defined yesh. That compels us to say that the Eibishter is so powerful that he can create something that's completely beyond, that's Ein Arech. In other words, the creation itself indicates on something that's beyond us. Atzilus indicates on Erech, on Kiruv, on closeness. Then we learn, especially once you know Elam Hazeh is created, then you realize that Atzilus is also Shalei Berech. Like we said before, even Atzmi is not Tefus Makkah. But where do you see it in the most obvious way? It's in Elam Hazeh. So the Yesh teaches us that. First of all, the actual creation of such a Yesh, because God didn't create something that's similar to himself. Atzilus, Chesed is Chesed is godly Chesed. Yes, it's not all of Elikus, but it's an expression of God's kindness, God's compassion, God's Gvura, etc. Hein hein Gvuresav. So the Yesh teaches us Ein Arech Lecha Be'elam Hazeh. What is this all telling us? That the Yesh itself tells us there's an ayin that's beyond it. So why did you say earlier? So the question remains, why did we say earlier that there's something commensurate, something similar? That we don't say it's ein davar mamish. So he says, now he's going to respond to that. B'kol mokim, gam zeh muchrich. Just as it's muchrich that the yesh and the ayin are a leap away from each other. And that's why it's called ayin. Like we said, it doesn't have any, it's not of any substance like the yeshes. It's also muchrich, he says. Nevertheless, it's also, we must say, she'ein b'chinas ayin legamri, that it's not in a state of complete ayin, meaning there's absolutely nothing there of any shape and form. The ma'achashu mokah yesh, being that it is a mokah to the yesh, that like I said before, chesed of atzilus is the mokah for mayim, for water in the yesh. You must say that it has some relationship and something commensurate, something in common. I know in common is not the right word. Erech, some relationship, some connection and relationship, I would say, or some relationship and connection to the yesh. Okay, so we can analyze this. So what's he saying here? He said two things at once. Is it shalei berach or is it not shalei berach? And he answered both. That's exactly what he said. If you're talking about the power of creation, we don't have the power to create. A yesh cannot create itself. So it's an ayin that clearly has something in it that's completely shalei berach. As I said, it didn't evolve. As much as spirituality will evolve, will not suddenly turn into physical. It needs some koyach, a koyach that's shalei berach of creation. But what he's saying is that koyach itself manifests in a way that relates to in some way with the thing that it creates. So though he doesn't say it here explicitly, the way I would explain it, especially in context, I would say the following. The only koyach habriya of creation comes from atzmus. We learned clearly earlier, remember that boira, though it does not define atzmus, because loy kol habriya, loy zeh kol atzmus shenivra memena elamis, so you can't say God is defined by being a creator. But creation has no other place except from atzmus. Only atzmus can create. Because even Oyer is not a creation, it's not a source. Oyer is the force that God uses, the creative force God uses to create. He so-called channels his creative energy through Oyer. But the creator is only atzmus. So I'm not sure why he didn't mention it explicitly here, but it's very clear, if you really read it all, that that power of creation is ein arech completely. Ein arech lecha. But the atzmus, the yesh amiti, channeled that energy through ayin amiti, through oir. That oir then channels itself through oir, the lower level of ayin amiti, into ayin of the yesh nivra. In other words, the ayin becomes an ayin that relates more to existence. It's still ayin, still oir, but now it's an oir, like I said, asar maimoris. Ayin of yesh amiti, there's no asar maimoris, there's no spheres, there's no shape, there's no form. All it is, the ayin of Ishmiti, is atzmus, wanting the creative, the koyach ha'atzmus shebe'er, so to speak. Whether it's the first interpretation of ayin, or the second interpretation, or the third interpretation, all of them is about the yesh amiti. So there's nothing there that you can talk about that substance or shape and form. Even remember, lifnei tzimtzum, that level doesn't even have rotzen yet, let alone a desire with details in it. Okay, but the Eibishter wanted the creation should make sense, that we should have stepping stones, both Mamayla Lamata, the God, that we should understand to some extent how this creative process works, and we should have stepping stones that we can work our way back and retrace the steps and connect. So the Eibishter made that this ayin should break into two, and the lower level should begin to relate to, it's still oyer, it's still oyer eliki, but now you have Esesphiras, from which evolve Asar Maimoris Nivra Elam. And as the Alter Rebbe explains in Shayechet V'Amunah, the letters continue to that's the word I want to use, evolve and permutations. So you have Tzirufim, and chilufim and gematrias, and the letters combine in different ways to create everything in existence. So even though Evan, as he says, stone, there's nowhere in the Asar HaMamoris you see the word stone, but the letters Aleph, Beis, Nun ultimately create the stone. So everything in existence has some form of divine energy that relates to it. So that's what he's saying. So there's two parts to that ayin. One part of the ayin, the creation part, the shalei berach. That's clear. And yet, creation is in a form, so that's richug be'erach. But yet creation is also in a form of relating. So that's the kiruv be'erach. You could even say that maybe the first one, the creation, is more from the ayin of the Yesh Amiti, from the higher levels, and the lower is the Yesh Nivra. He doesn't say that specific explicitly, so that's why I'm careful. But you could even say, even in the ayin of the Yesh Nivra, remember the last page he said that even the Chetzenius Se'er, you have, remember the Proteus. So you could say that even in the lower level of the third interpretation of the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, there's also two levels. One with the Oyr, even though it's beginning to relate to existence, it's still Oyr. Therefore, it's still Me'in HaMoyer, and therefore it still has that Ein HaReich of creation, the creative process. And then there's the Oyr as it relates to and gives shape to existence. So both are correct. It's two dimensions in the Oyr itself. That's essentially what he just said. So there's ein arech in it and there's an erech in it. But the bottom line is he wants to explain how the word ayin here has a different meaning. It doesn't mean insignificant, like no tfisis mokim. Here ayin means beyond, of a different nature. It doesn't have the substance. And yet it has some connection. So now he says the following. We haven't heard that word in a while, but it was the beginning of this whole discussion of Yesh Ayin Yesh on page 1141. I know it's only 10 pages ago, but it's months ago when we learned it because we learned so much with the Tzadik Daled. So the day of Das Tachten, which means the perspective from below. Remember, there's the perspective of Yesh Amiti, that would be Das Elyon. There, the ayin, it means insignificant, ain't a tefes mokum klal at all. This is how, but day of Das Tachten, how Das Tachten sees it from the below perspective, the hainu Das hamakabel, meaning the Das, the perception of the recipient, not the perception of the giver, of the recipient, not of the mashpia, of the makabel. Shuhu ma'ayin liyesh. Hainu shamokar hu loy dover. This is how the Deya sees it, that it sees it ma'ayin liyesh. That ayin is a higher level. The mokir is a higher level. That's not a dover. We say, where did it come from? Where did this creation come from? And we can't answer it in any type of tangible way. So there's a mysterious unknown. The ayin here means it's loy dover. It's not something we define as substance. But that does not mean that we say ayin mamish that is completely non-existent. As an insignificant or completely non-existent, you can't say that because it is a source. It ultimately created this existence. The hanivra ene yochel haseklal b'chinas ayin mamish. Ayin mamish, completely ayin mamish, something beyond chesed and gvura, beyond all the worlds. A nivra cannot comprehend, cannot in any way fathom a little ayin mamish, b'chinas heder amitzias, something that's completely non-existent. Ach zeis masig. However, this that we're talking about, an ayin of a yesh nivra, though it's beyond us because it's not substance, but we're not saying it completely doesn't exist. Something is there. But that something is called ayin. Ach zeis masig. This indeed, what the nivra does comprehend, shebehechrech lemer, that you have to say sha'amokir hu b'chinas ayin, that the source is in a state of ayin, meaning not yesh, not ayin amiti, as in nothing exists, but it's not yesh, it's not substantial substance as we know it. And we say that only means that it's not existent as we exist. In other words, it's not like substance as what we consider to be an existent reality. And because of this, and due to this, that it's something that's not like our Metzias, we can't call it yesh. We call it ayin. A different reality. An unknown reality, a non-substantial reality, probably is the best way to define it. Because he's not using the word unknown here. He doesn't say we don't he says we. It's not like us. Oh, now he's going to say a second meaning in what this ayin is. So right now, ayin means we're not talking about non-existence. We're talking about an existence that's not like our existence. So in a sense, it's like almost saying in Avedidika words, you'd say, I began my life thinking I'm the most important person. I came to realize I'm not. I came to realize I was created. I was put here. So I know one thing is for sure, I'm not God. Someone will say, but what is God like? You say, I don't know. That I can't tell you. I don't know what God is like. I just know I'm not it. So the yesh can make a declaration that I always thought the yesh, I was the center of the universe. Now I know I'm not it. What is it? It's ayin. Some ayin, something that's not me. That I know. It's not what this is. Avram Avinu, he's looking for God. He knows it's not the idols in his father's collection and manufacturing plant. That he already figured out very early on. So he went looking, where is God? Is it the sun? Is it the moon? Is it the heavens? And he kept coming to the same thing. It can't be that either, because that's also part of creation. So he came to a point where he didn't know what God is, but he definitely knew it wasn't this. So in many ways, that's like what he's saying. The ayin, we're not talking about non-existent. We're talking about something that's not us. It's not like a yesh. I'm talking more Avedidika Asius. He's not saying that here exactly. Here he's using more Askolodika terms, that the yesh tells us that the creation, the creative force that created it, is not like a yesh. So what is it? It's an ayin. Like he says, it does not like the mitzias hayesh. Then he says, v'gam nikra ayin. I'll already go till the end of the paragraph. And it's called, another reason it's called ayin from the perspective of das tachten, from below, from our perspective, from the makabel, the recipient. V'gam nikra ayin legaba yesh. It's also called ayin from the perspective of the yesh. Lefisha eina musig b'hayesh. Now he's saying, because it's not we don't understand it. We can't comprehend it. Someone will say to you, tell me what this ayin is like. So the first thing, it's called ayin because it doesn't have substance like yesh. Now he's saying we don't understand. Obviously, these are interdependent, but he's giving another aspect to the ayin, that it's a mystery. It's not understood by us, by the yesh. Al shem zeh nikra ayin. That's why we call it ayin. Like, what is it? Ayin. The mysterious ayin. Kili yese bilti musig. Being that it's something that's not comprehensible, so we can't apply to it a name. We can't describe it. We can't label it, basically, with a name. The only thing we can do is call it ayin. Unknown. The unknown. The unidentifiable. The mystery. So even though the word ayin means, someone says, where did this existence come from? Someone says, something from nothing. We don't mean nothing. We mean nothing, number one, that it's not like us. It's not something from something. In other words, something like us. And number two, from nothing means like poof. It came from something that we don't understand. Man. So the Jews called man. Why'd they call it man? The bread from heaven, lechem min hashamayim. Ki lo yodu mahu. The word man comes from mahu. What is this? So man means wonder. Mazeh, mahu. They see this thing falling with the dew, with a towel in the morning. Strange creature. It's a strange entity. So they called it man, mahu. What is it? Ma. It's like when we say about chachma ma'ayin timotz, koyach ma. What is it? Where did it come from? It's a mysterious force where it came from. The hadover habilti musig iref shalikreis rak b'shem ayin. A thing that's not understood, you can't call it by anything except with the word ayin. So there we have two meanings in ayin from the perspective below, das tachten, from the perspective of the makabel. From the perspective of the mashpia, ayin means insignificant, completely non-existent, absolutely like nothing's there, as we learned. From the perspective from below, ayin, two meanings. One, it's not substance in any way, dover ma, that we relate to. And number two, it's a mystery. It's something we don't understand. That's what he says about the two different interpretations in ayin. Okay, so we finished the paragraph at the bottom of 1151. We'll stop here.